Welcome to today's partner web conference on the Regression Suite Automation Tool. Presenting for us today from Microsoft, we've got Robert Badawi and Mark Dedehira. With that, Robert, you now have the floor. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. Mark and I will be talking and demonstrating the Regression Suite Automation Tool today for Dynamics 365 for Finance and Operations. This tool is currently in private preview, but will be generally available during the first weeks of October. So let's get started. So this Regression Suite Automation Tool enables functional power users, not developers, to record business tasks using the Finance and Operations Task Recorder and convert them into a suite of automated tests without the need to write any source code. It's going to significantly reduce the time and cost of your user acceptance testing when you are taking a Microsoft update or before you are applying a custom code or configuration to your finance and operations production environment. Your test libraries will be stored and distributed in lifecycle services using the BPM tool. And as BPM is fully integrated with Azure DevOps, formerly known as VSTS, you will use Azure DevOps for test execution, reporting, and investigation. And a key feature is that your test parameters are going to be stored in an Excel workbook, so you don't need to re-record a particular test case just to change input or output parameters of the test. Some of the key features that are worth highlighting. First of all, the target scenarios is the user acceptance testing phase of an implementation, and also post go live before applying new code, hotfixes, or any configuration changes. These are the key scenarios we're targeting with the first release of this tool. You'll be able to author and execute business cycle tests, and we'll talk about what this means in test classification later, on any environment that can access finance and operations via a web browser. That's key. It means you don't need to run this tool on any finance and operations environment. It just has to be a Windows 10 or a Windows Server laptop, as long as your finance and operations environment is accessible via a web browser. You will run it against a sandbox environment with a copy of your production database. You record once, but you can play back multiple times with different data sets and also different legal entities. You can also use this tool to validate against expected values. You can chain test cases as part of an end-to-end test by passing parameters from one test case to the next. So the output of a particular test case can be a variable that's the input of a test case to be run just later on in the test run. You will use Azure DevOps to manage your test suites, test runs, and investigate test results. And as well, for those who need more advanced scenarios, there's a command line version of this tool that allow you to do a lot of this from the command line and possibly use more build and test automation features of Azure DevOps to take advantage of the tool. Before I proceed, some limitations worth mentioning. You cannot use this tool to do integration tests since it's based on the task recording. It's all within the client of finance and operation. You cannot do Office integration tests, some workflow scenarios as well. It still does not support the mobile framework and then the retail point of sale and modern point of sale portals. Here's a slide that talks a little bit about the end-to-end flow of how you will be going with managing, authoring, distributing, and configuring your test cases before you actually start using this tool. So BPM will be the tool to author or record your test recording and distribute your test cases as a library organized by business processes. Once you select the BPM that represents your test library. You configure your test plans by first synchronizing BPM into your Azure DevOps project, and then you configure parameters and data for running your tests. Within Azure DevOps, you'll be creating test plans and test suites to define this list of test cases that need to execute together depending on the phase of your implementation. The third thing you will be doing is executing and managing your test results. So this is when you will be using the actual Regression Suite Automation Tool. You will be able to update parameters and test data from the tool itself, execute the test, and then go to Azure DevOps to look at test results and investigate. So let's go to a demo. I hope it will explain a little bit more about what the tool can do. I'm going to start with BPM. So this is my lifecycle services project, and I have a BPM library, a simple one that I built for the purpose of this demo. It has 3 business processes, and under each of these business processes, I have recorded 2 tasks. You can see create purchase order here, post product receipts, etc. Each of these tasks is associated to the task recording that I recorded in finance and operation, and I have saved to this business process library. So at this stage, this is my library of test cases organized by business processes. I have not started my testing yet. It was only my authoring and organization tool for this library of test cases. If you click on this ellipsis here, if you're ready to start your testing or your implementation, you can synchronize your test cases with VSTS, what is now called Azure DevOps. This particular library is already pre-synchronized for this demo. And there's an option here that you'll also need is to synchronize test cases as well, which means your task recordings become test cases in your Azure DevOps project. So if I switch windows right here and I go to my Azure DevOps project, this is the same hierarchy that you see in BPM that has been synchronized to my project. All of this has automatically been created for me. Business processes are typically synchronized as epics or features, but what's of interest today are the test cases. So if I go to this create purchase order test case, it's already set up for me to be executed, whether I'm automating it or I'm executing it manually. It has all the steps of the test cases right here, automatically synchronized, like I said. And if you go to the attachment, there are some files that have been attached to this test case that have come directly from BPM, and these files will be used by the tool to enable the automations. These are the test recordings file. What I also did to set up my tests is I created test plans. Typically, your test library is going to contain a whole lot of test cases, but you don't necessarily organize by business processes. But the way you execute your tests will be based on test plans or test suites, because you're not always executing your entire test library. It depends on the phase of the implementation. You might be interested in a particular subset of it. We can call it a test suite. And you will be creating test suites right here within the Azure DevOps web portal by going to the test plans tab on the left. I have created a simple test suite right here. And as you can see, I can also define the order in which test cases can be organized within a test suite. You can add an existing test case to your test suite by clicking on this Add Existing button here, or you can even create new test cases if you have ones that don't come necessarily from BPM. So once you have a test plan and test suites ready to go, you will go ahead and start the Regression Suite test tool. Here it is. It's a lightweight desktop app that you download. The plan is to make it available on Microsoft.com/download. Once you start it for the first time, you will get nothing in the grid right here. You can click on the configure button to tell the tool where your Azure DevOps project is by specifying a URL and an access token. And also some more information about the finance and operations environment you are testing by giving the host name, the SOAP host name, the admin user. There's a certificate you need to set up for authentication. This is all explained in the user manual. And a couple of other parameters where your working directory is for some local files to be generated, and as well a timeout value that when you run a particular run or a test suite, it's a number of minutes for your test suites to time out. You should pick this after running the test suite a couple of times. So if a test suite goes execution goes beyond this particular timeout, it will fail and exit. First thing you would do after setting up is click this load button. What this load button does is it loads the test plan that you have selected in your settings. I just clicked it and I have selected this demo test plan that I showed you a couple of minutes earlier. So it's loading them now from my Azure DevOps project. Give it a second here. And it loaded all the test cases in my test suite. The order is also, the order in which they execute also comes from the order that I defined in my Azure DevOps project. The first time you do this, you will not have the parameters file listed here. I will talk a second about what this means, what these parameter files mean. You will only get the test cases. The next thing you would do is you will select the test cases that you want to set up. Setting up a test case at this stage means generating automation file. Automation file are binary files and other data files that are needed for the test case to run. So this is where the developer role is being replaced by this action. So you can select the test cases you're interested in. I'm going to select 2 for the sake of this example and click on new. This will generate C# code, will generate binaries, compile binaries out of the C# code, and data files for you to run this test case. So you click new. These 2 parameters files have disappeared because it's regenerating them. And once it's ready, so at this stage, what's happening is we're taking a task recording, we are creating a C# file out of it, and we compile the C# file into an assembly, a DLL, needed for this test case to run. We also create a parameter test file to separate the test parameters from the test execution. You can select, for example, this one and click on edit. It'll open Excel, and these are the parameter file for this particular test case. Here's some general parameters about this test case. It will run in the USMF company. This is a safe variable. I'll talk about this a little bit later. This test case goes through 2 forms. These are the parameters that are used in the task recordings that you can modify when you play back your test case. These are the parameters of the free text invoice form. And these are parameters for the invoice totals forms as well. Next thing you do after generating the automation file and setting up your parameter is to actually run the test case. You can select 1 or multiple and execute them. I'm going to select here the free text invoice test case and run it. It will take a minute or 2. In the meantime, maybe it's a good time to take some questions, Mark. Mark will be moderating questions.
Okay, Robert, I think we have a couple of questions regarding the synchronization between BPM and DevOps, especially how it synchronizes with the existing templates that are already there, if there will be interference, if it's synchronizing separately. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that topic.
Existing templates, as in if you have custom templates, is this the question?
Yeah, for instance, in LCS, if you have, instead of using the standard synchronization for the Epic's work items, but you have your own template, will that interfere with how the test cases are synchronized?
Oh, I see. So currently what VSTS supports is Agile, CMMI, and Scrum. We don't support any other process template. However, if your template only makes additive changes to these process templates, you will get a warning, but you should be okay. It should not interfere, especially when synchronizing test cases. You will not be able to map, for example, if you have your own work item type that is not an epic or a feature, you will not be able to map to this one, but it should not interfere with the synchronization itself.
And then related to the question is also the question whether you are able to influence how it is synchronized. So I assume that the question here is, can you change namings of the items which are created or so?
For the task recordings or the test cases, in this case, that are created in BPM, the BPM library is always the master. So if you want to make any changes, it's a one-way sync. If you want to make any changes to a particular test case, title or steps, you can make them in BPM. I recommend you make them in BPM, not in VSTS. Now, having said this, BPM is not a required tool. It's a recommended best practice tool to organize your test libraries. The test tool itself only requires DevOps. BPM, as I mentioned, is a way for you to author and distribute your libraries across projects. Once you synchronize BPM with Azure DevOps, it's a one-way sync, because we do want the task recording itself and the test steps and the title to always be in sync. And if you edit it in VSTS itself, or in Azure DevOps itself, then it's possible your test steps will be out of sync with the actual recording that was coming from finance and operations. So yes, you can edit the test case steps and title, but do it in BPM if you are using BPM sync.
Another good question is, do you need administration rights for running the regression test suite tool?
This current version that is going to be available in a couple of weeks, you will need to be an administrator on the finance and operations environment. But this is not going to be a requirement for too long. We are already working and testing the ability to run this tool as any security role. And this will come in a subsequent version of the tool.
And a question from Llewellyn asking whether we are able to integrate the test runs from the build machine.
I'm assuming you mean run the test cases that your developers that require development that you're running in your build and test automation, integrate them within this. You can, in a sense, as you can reuse the same task recordings, because the source of all of these test cases can be task recordings, but it will not run necessarily against the same test cases. But yes, you can start from the same recordings, from the same BPM library, and synchronize as into your Azure DevOps project. There'll be, I guess, we'll let for questions regarding the other test framework, that what we call the sys-test framework, that usually requires developers to be involved. Mark is going to talk a little bit about that at the end of the session. Maybe this question will be clarified more. So, do you want to take another question, or should I proceed, Mark?
No, Robert, you can continue.
So I hope everybody enjoyed the nice execution of this test case. For the sake of the demo and time, I'm not going to execute all of them, but I guess running one makes the point of what happens here. I can see that the test case has passed. What I want to do right now is go to my Azure DevOps project and look at the results. So I can go right here and look at test runs. And this is the last run that happened today. It's a run only with one test case. You can say that it says completed, and the pass rate was 100%. I did only run one test case, so it has 100% pass rate. Let me go and check a more interesting run before it that I ran just a little bit earlier today, and it tells me it needs investigation because the pass rate is 66.6%. In this run, I did run 3 test cases. 2 of them passed and 1 has failed. I will go through the test results, and I'm not really interested in the ones that passed. I am going to the one that failed. This is the one that posts a product receipt after I create a purchase order. And I go and take a look at it, and right here I have every step that was executed. It's logged here within the test results. And then I notice that I get a warning in the product after I type a value in the product receipt field. The warning comes from the info log, and it's telling me product receipt PR1 was already used on date 8/22. So it looks like I'm not running with the clean data. That was my mistake. So this run this failure is basically by design. And then it found an error in the info log saying the operation has been canceled, the product received, and the operation is product received posting. So these steps, whenever there's a failure, are always updated to the test result, gives you an idea what failed. Now, if you run into an exception, so a crash or anything that is not expected, that is not within within the test steps, so something hangs or a screen pops up or anything that's happened that is not expected, you will also get a snapshot here of the machine when the test was running. Will give you a better idea what happened when this exception occurred. But in this case, this is an error that is within the design of the test. And you can tell that the error is coming from the info log. So that's why we didn't get a snapshot, but you actually get a listing of the steps and what happened. There are also some attachments here, the C# code that was executed for this particular test case. The test recording is the XML file, and this is a more detailed log of the execution of the test case. A couple of things I want to mention too. There are some features that you will find, or I hope you'll find, very useful. If I open the Excel file of the create purchase order test case, you will see that there's a section called saved variables, and right here I have a variable. Don't mind the long name of the variable. It's a variable that was saved during the execution or the recording of this test case. This means this is a variable that is global to the entire test run. So I can copy this value and paste it as an input to any test that executes later. So this is the purchase order ID. And then I can go right here, for example, and open the post product receipt test case and use that particular variable as an input to having trouble opening the Excel file right here. One second. Let me go and try to open it manually from File Explorer. This is my working directory right now, and the Excel files are all right here. So if I go ahead and open the post product receipt Excel file, you can see that during my execution, I have pasted this variable right here, where in the sysquery form, which is an input value into the next test case. Another feature that is useful is creating, for example, during creation of sales order, I have a validation step. So if I open the sales order Excel file, give me 1 second right here. Excel is not behaving well on my system. If I open the sales order sales file, there is a validation step inside this. So I'm going to skip this and I'll go and demo what I mean by this. I have finance and operations running right here. And I'm going to start my task recorder. I'll click on create recording. Just call it demo right now. I'll start my recording. And this is the demo fleet management application. I'm going to select a rental. And during the recording, if you right click on any field and you select task recording, you can see the context menu copy option here. When you do this, it allows you, it will add a step that's called note the value of this particular field. This step will actually create that global variable during this test run that you can use. So this is the step to use to create variables across your task recordings and test cases. What you can also do is you can right click and under task recorder, click on validate. When you say the validate step, you select the current value you want to validate. And it also added a validation step to my test case. Once you add that validation step, it is also added to your test case. It means it's also added to your automation of the test case, and it will add a validation step. And during the execution, it will make sure that the value of this particular field is equal to full in this case. And since it's a data parameter, you can also change that value during execution by editing it in the Excel file. So this is all I had from a demo perspective. I think I'm going to go back to the presentation right now, and I'm going to let Mark take over and talk a little bit about strategy and learning. Maybe we can take another set of questions for 4 minutes, and Mark, you can proceed.
Yeah, for questions, I think there was some questions regarding do you run it on a one box or do you run it? Can you run it on tier 2 and higher environments?
Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, this you can run it on any laptop. You don't need to run it on any machine that actually has finance and operation itself. And as long as your environment is accessible via a browser, the tool will work, which means you can run it on a dev box, you can run it on a test box, you can run it on a sandbox, or any finance and operation environment that is accessible via a web browser.
And then there was a good question regarding the security. Do we connect always as admin to the system?
Today you always connect as admin, but I also mentioned that we will have a feature shortly after we release it in a couple of weeks that allows you to connect as the security role that you specify.
And a question whether we are able to run it silently so that we don't have the user interface popping up.
There is a command line version of the tool that you can do all the actions that I demoed from a command line. It is not going to be documented publicly in the first release, but if folks are interested in trying it out, they can reach out to solution architecture or the product team and we'll be able to provide these instructions.
Yeah, but at this moment, if we run it from the command line, it will also spin up the user graphics.
Oh, that is the question. That is correct. Yes, the goal. This is the feature of the tool that is going through the user interface or through the web browser. If you are interested to run headlessly, you will be using our other sys-test framework that runs without spinning off the interface, which is and it depending on the test strategy you are pursuing, and this is actually a good segue into your next slide, Mark, I guess.
Yep, absolutely. And a question whether we have timestamps on the loggings.
Timestamps. There are timestamps, but I'm assuming the question is whether we have perf counters, as in how long it took. In addition that we have timestamps, we're also going to have perf counters. This is also not going to be a part of the version 1, but shortly after, I would say several weeks after release version 1, we will also log the amount it takes for every step to execute and for every test case to execute. So it's not there in the version I demoed, but it's there in the version we are developing as of today. So I would assume several weeks after this particular version goes out, we'll have this feature ready.
Okay.
The mic is yours, Mark.
Okay, so I'm going to continue a little bit about the strategy that you should be using. And first of all, I want to start with the basic of testing. And typically, if we're talking about testing, people are referring to the pyramid, where in the bottom part of the pyramid, you have the unit testing. And then typically unit tests, it's testing of a very small piece of code, piece of functionality, such as a class. So typically what you will have in that case is that you have a lot of test cases. And that's also the reason why typically you see them in the bottom of this pyramid, because typically the number of unit tests what you have is way higher than the components you will be seeing on the higher level. So the level above is what they are calling the component tests. So typically there you will group some functionality, some classes typically, and you combine them, for instance, like such a thing like a business logic, a scheduling engine, or a user interface part. But typically what you will see, it's a combination of artifacts. And typically what you use them for validating your requirements. If we're going one step higher in the test pyramid, you still see typically we're talking there about integration tests. And what you see there is that there is you're going to combine multiple components, might be all being together. But also I think in integration tests, what you will see also is that you do have interactions, might be interactions with external systems. And you really have to see how data is flowing from one system to another and is coming back. And on the top level, it is about business cycle tests. It's typically where you have those scenarios, hire to fire, quotation to cash, procurement to pay. It's really using end-to-end scenarios. And what Robert has been presenting here is the tool that Microsoft is using now, the Regression Suite Automation Tool, which is typically used for being able for doing an automation on those top-level scenarios, the end-to-end scenarios. And what it absolutely also means is that we should not stop with just doing the business cycle test. So the Regression Suite Automation Tool is not like a silver bullet, and once you have done this kind of test, you don't need to do any other tests any longer. It's just one of the pieces of your test strategy. And your test strategy for a project should also include the other tests. So don't think because we're doing end-to-end scenario testing that you don't need unit testing or that you don't need integration tests. The end-to-end scenarios is only one part of your complete test scenario. One of the things that I definitely want to highlight was when I start trying to do the first tests regarding end-to-end testing a couple of years ago, starting with using the Perf SDK, I came to an article that I definitely found very interesting, because they were comparing, they were making a comparison between unit testing and end-to-end testing. And basically, what the author was saying is that if you compare it in how fast you can develop a test or how soon you can get a result, then typically for unit testing, that's very fast compared to end-to-end, where it's taking a lot more before you have defined your good test. And if we're talking about reliability, typically a unit test, because it's so small and as a developer, you know exactly what are the input parameters, what are the possible combinations, what are the output parameters. It is much easier for making reliable tests for unit testing than it is for end-to-end tests. End-to-end tests typically spawn a lot of processes, so there is way more places where something in the test can go wrong. If we're looking regarding isolation of failures, if an end-to-end test fails at the end, then if you want to understand where it fails, typically you will have to look into the different components, trying to find out where it fails. So for a unit test, isolating a failure and finding out what went wrong is much easier than for end-to-end tests. So the question is, why would you do end-to-end tests then? And of course, an end-to-end test, you do it because you want to simulate a real user. And an end-to-end test is really what the end users are doing. And unit testing typically is only taking a very small piece out of it. The author was concluding out of this thing that actually he says that the title of this article is "Just Say No More to End-to-End Testing." That's the only thing that I disagree with. It's not because it is more complex, the end-to-end testing, that we should conclude that we should not try to automate them. If we're looking into typically, just before go live, there is a group of people, a steering committee, which has to make a decision, go or no go. And those kind of decisions are made based on testing, because in an ERP, if you bring your ERP live, the fact that you have all those integrated scenarios and that you are having data which is flowing from one scenario, from one department into another department, it might be that if you have data which is in the beginning wrong, that you will only see the issues once you are a couple of days, even weeks further, and it might only popping up in other departments, such as if you try to post an invoice, that suddenly you realize that those invoices cannot be posted because you have some missing data in earlier processes. And that's the reason why for at least the implementations that I was working with, that we always, before we did a go, no go, we did a real scenario test, which could take a couple of days, where we just made sure that we had simulations for the major processes and were able just to verify that those processes went fluid through all the different departments. And the way we were organizing them was by just writing up some test data and then going through the whole flow and making sure that for each of the users, we gave him his data that he needed to add into the system. And we were observing whether, first of all, the system was capable of making sure that the flow through all the different modules was working fine. But as a consequence, you're also seeing if your users are well trained, if they do know how to bring the data into the system, if they do know how to look up data which is coming from other departments. So if all data is flowing through all those departments. And for a go live, I think it's still good for doing such kind of manual tests, because it's not only the system, it's also seeing if your users are well trained, if they have all the necessary tools. and as such, doing the test manually still makes sense. But then once you go into regression testing, and every time you'd make some small modifications, you cannot depend any longer on the whole department or all test users being able for doing such extended tests manually. And that's where it's really, to my opinion, is important that we are able for doing recording of those end-to-end scenarios, and that we are able to run them automatically afterwards.
And I think what I would add to this, Mark, is like you see the red bulb next to reliable. What we're trying to do is allow the tool to make those end-to-end tests a little more reliable, and to get rid of the historical perception that automation of end-to-end testing is usually not reliable. This is what we're hoping to achieve. They'll still be a lot less reliable than running a unit test, because there are always UI elements that might come in the way and changes and so on. But this is the area we're hoping we can encourage folks to write end-to-end tests using the tool.
Absolutely. So another thing that I definitely have found out during the initial test is that what is the use of the task recorder? I think if you look from unit testing, because the unit test is so well known, and typically the test is also executed by the development team, or a team, if you have a separate test team, which is very close with the engineering team, it is typically written there, hand-coded, because you know it everything, and it's so easy for hand-coding it. But if you look at from the business cycle, the end-to-end, then if you needed to find somebody who was able for writing an end-to-end test according all the different aspects of the test, then it would be very hard. And it's here where the task recorder becomes very handy, because the only thing you need to know is you need to know how users are executing the tasks into the UI, and the system is just recording all the necessary information, and is actually generating the code for you. So there is no need for writing any code in this tool. So just a small example for what do I mean with an end-to-end test. So typically what you could do is, this is an example where we have a department who wants to procure some raw material. And the scenario starts actually with the buyer, who's just going into the system, creates a purchase order. And for this specific example, he was also the person who was confirming the purchase order. Out of that, just an order confirmation was executed to the vendor. And the vendor then would give you some confirmation dates. The confirmation dates can either be entered again into the purchase order or not. But typically the next step in the scenario would be that your supplier will pick the products and ship them to you. And at that moment, goods will be received into your warehouse. And it is your store operator, so it's a different department, who actually will do the reception of those goods, and who will book the reception of the goods also into the system. As a consequence, your vendor, once delivery has been happened, will also send you an invoice. That invoice typically arrives into your financial department, and there you will do the booking of the invoice. The reason why I've put this scenario on the slide is just to make sure that you do understand that in such end-to-end scenario testings, you have different roles and different personas who are involved. And although you could easily do one recording and record everything from the user interface in one big recording, I would definitely give the advice that if you have different roles, it's probably good for having different recordings. There are some reasons for that. First of all, if you would use the recordings also as a kind of training material, then typically there will hardly none of the users be interested in seeing the full flow. But persons who are working into procurement will look to the task that they have to do. Others, finance, would only be interested in the task they need to do for booking invoices and so on. So it is, to my opinion, good advice for making sure that you have recordings depending on what kind of role is personas who are executing those tests. And also from an experience, I've learned that although you can record everything in one big recording, and that we do have sufficient possibilities for if you need to change something, that you can change the recording, still it makes it easier if you have small recordings and just have to edit the smaller pieces than if you have to make modifications to a large scenario. So what I've, as an output of that, looking to end-to-end testings, what you need to do is you need to be able to have to be able to group your scenarios. And as Robert has been showing, there is a way that we can order them and then group them together so that you can execute a selected number of tasks. A second thing is because you have different recordings and so you will have different playbacks, you need to be sure that your data is resistant. So if you create a purchase order in the buyer scenario, you need to find a way of passing the newly created purchase order and be able to use it into your next scenario. And I'm coming to the next bullet point as well. So it means that you need to be able to find an output, define an output variable, being able to see what was the newly created purchase order and using that, that newly created purchase order as an input for finding your purchase order and then book the reception of the goods and also booking the invoice. And typically what you need to do also is you want to do some validations in between. So for instance, if you would just create a production order and you know that you start production order for a specific item with a quantity of 3, and in your test you have done quantity good for the production order to 1 quantity bad, you could easily book a validation test by adding a recording where you would test that what is the quantity on hand at a specific moment. And you know that after you have run your create production and all the production scenarios, once you have reported the good quantity, your quantity on hand for that product must be too higher. And that's the way typically for new products, how you could predict upfront what should be the outcome of a test, and that you would be easily having a way that you just need to validate that check test instead of having to walk through all the different steps to see if everything was working fine. Also, quite important, and that's from experience, although it is quite easy, you go in front of the screen, you just start your task recorder, you just record everything you're doing, you stop, you make a test case of it. The truth is that if you work like that, you probably will have to do your recordings quite often. So to my opinion and my experience, I definitely would advise you to think upfront about what is your scenario, what kind of different recordings do I want to have in between, what kind of tests do I really want to make, what kind of parameters do I want to have so that afterwards we can run the same test with different parameters without having to do a full recording again. And that's the reason why I definitely advise you all not to try to skip the BPM. I know that for doing the testing itself, it is not necessarily for passing the BPM, but I think as a best practice, definitely advise you to follow, write down your scenarios, make sure that they make sense from a user afterwards so that you can use them as training as well, and then make sure that you are just filling in all those task recordings into the BPM. As I mentioned already, try not to put everything in one big recording, try to split them. Also quite important is while you do your recording, try to think about what happens if you are in a multi-user behavior. Typically, if you would create a new production order, once you close the production order, your cursor will be on the newly created production order, and you could just start a new recording from there. If you are in a multi-user behavior, that is not true. While you were closing your production orders, other people might have created production orders, and it's absolutely not sure where your cursor will be, whether it will be on your production order or will it be on the production order which was created after yours. So typically, if you want to continue working on the same production order, make sure that always you start the follow-up recording with going to the all production orders and do a filter on your newly created production order so that you're absolutely sure that you continue where you have stopped. We do have also a possibility for randomizing input in Excel parameters. So you could use, for instance, the random function if you want to have a number for an invoice number. For instance, each time you run the test, you need to have a new unique invoice number. So instead of every time going manually in and change your invoice number and add a new one, you could just use the Excel random function, which will generate you a random number for your invoice, but will make sure that you can rerun the tests over and over without having to modify the parameters in Excel. And as a last finding, I would also say try to avoid selecting from a list. Although in the task recorder you could select and the recording will tell you that you have selected the third item from a list, you need to be absolutely sure that the third item in the list will always be the same. So typically it would be better just typing in the name and be sure that even if the list is changed and new items have been added, that you're still finding the right item in the list. That's it for me, Robert. Maybe we can try to see if there are still some questions.
Yes, we have about 4 minutes left. Let's see if there are more questions and we'll answer them.
Okay, I have here a question. Can tests be parallelized to run faster?
Currently, if you use the UI, obviously, this particular tool, you cannot parallelize them in the way I showed it. And actually, we would want to know why you would want to parallelize them, because in this case, since you're testing end-to-end, you do want it to run in sequence because that's a key part of your test. Where we recommend parallelization, and it's possible, is when you run unit tests and more component-based tests, where your tests are usually data agnostics and you're testing a component. Having said this, we've gotten several asks for this. We can take a look at what we can do there in terms of speed of executions. But again, the key thing here is to run an end-to-end test, which is by definition a sequential test, not a parallelized test. Mark, anything else you want to add there?
No, I think indeed Parallelizing, well, the thing what you could think about is if you really want to play a multi-user test, you could just run the same test in parallel. That's possible. I would not advise it to run it on the same client. There is a limit to the number of parallel tasks you can have on one client because we're using the Selenium technology and it's using quite some memory for mimicking the user interface. Yes. But you could indeed just start the test on different scripts and have a kind of multi-user scenario.
Yeah, absolutely. The key thing here, since we're going through the web browser, if you're running it on the same box, they are going to step on each other and it'll make you run quite unreliable anyway. But if you have different client machines, you will be simulating a good multi-user scenario, like Mark said, and there's nothing stopping you from running this tool, whether from the command line or from the UI, against the same URL, but from different machines.
We have a lot of questions, or a couple of questions regarding against what version of Dynamics is the tool running? Is it platform dependent and so on?
This is a good question. The validation of this tool, when we started development or when we started getting ready for release, the validation happened on platform update 15. So officially, that's what we're saying we support. So anything that is platform update 15 or newer, it should technically work on older platforms, but this is not the official support, or this is not where it was validated at some point. It's based on the Perf SDK, on the same framework that the Perf SDK runs. So since the Perf SDK does execute on older platform, it should technically work on things like PU12 or even older. But the official support is on PU15 and newer.
Okay. So a good question here also is it possible to validate a report content and or a layout with the RSAT test?
It is not supported right now. It is actually not within the scope in the near future. The focus is only on tests that are recorded using or validated using the task recording as well. And since the task recorder today cannot understand the layout of a particular report, it is not supported.
There's a question, where could we find the user guide?
Good question. I am not sure if the person that's asking it is a part of the private preview. If they're a part of the private preview, there's a Yammer group where the user guide and the tool is located today. If they're interested in always being part of the private preview, because right now in the private preview we're going to start showing version 2 of the tool, they can go to experience.dynamics.com and sign up for the Insider program. But this particular version will be available for everyone the first week of October, and it will be available with its user guide on microsoft.com/download. Again, if you're interested in having preview bits and access new versions of the tool earlier for validation, go to experience.dynamics.com and sign up for the Insider program.
Good question as well is, do we as Microsoft have already a suite of test cases that we can share with partners, customers?
We do. We run a lot of test cases internally. We currently are not planning to support these as test cases. It adds a lot of management on us because then it's considered a part of the release. However, you can reuse any of the task recordings that we ship out of the APQC library as potentially a test case for you. So the answer is, in addition to, we are not planning to release any test cases right now, other than what's already available in the APQC library, which are technically just tasks, but you could repurpose them as test cases.
And maybe as a last question, is there any additional cost for this tool?
The tool itself is free, but it requires you to have a test manager license in Azure DevOps. So depending on your Visual Studio license or on your Azure DevOps license, you might already have access to Test Manager. If you have a basic Visual Studio subscription or a basic Azure DevOps subscription and you don't have Test Manager, I believe a standalone license, at least the list price, is $52 per month, but it depends on your enterprise agreements. It might be a lot less. Okay, I guess we did run out of time. Thanks everyone for joining. Thanks Mark for moderating the questions as well, in addition to being a co-speaker.
All right, great.
Thank you.
So I've gone ahead and added an announcement there on the left-hand side of the screen for everyone with the link to the survey for today's session. Certainly, again, appreciate additional feedback that you're able to provide to us via that link there. It gives us an opportunity to understand what you liked about today's session, and also what you may like to see in future sessions as well. So with that, that concludes today's webcast. Hope everyone has a great day.